I have sold roasted chestnuts on the corner of the King's Mile for 31 winters, and in all that time, I have learned to read a crowd the way a sailor reads the sky. You feel the weather of it before you see it. A slack, wandering crowd on a market morning has one temperature. A crowd that has come to gawk at the guard has another, warmer, sillier, prone to laughter, full of people holding up their little glass phones to catch a man who will not blink. And then there is the third kind, the kind that gathers a knot inside itself, a hard little clot of attention that thickens and quiets, because someone in it has decided to make a fool of a man who cannot answer back. That morning, I felt the third kind arrive before I understood why. My hands went on turning chestnuts. My eyes went to the gate. The guard on the eastern post of the Harrogate forecourt that day was Sergeant Deverell Thorne, though I did not know his name yet, and neither did the boy who had come to torment him. To the crowd he was simply the statue, the tall black bearskin, the red wool tunic buttoned to the throat, the white gloves folded one over the other on the stock of his rifle, the polished toes of his boots set exactly on the worn stone where 1,000 pairs of boots had stood before his. He stood in the box of mourning shadow the gatehouse threw across the cobbles, and he did not move, not the twitch of a finger, not the flicker of an eye. The whole loud river of the King's Mile broke around him and rejoined itself on the far side, and he stood in the middle of it like a stone in a stream, and the water did not know it was being divided. The boy's name, I would learn later, was Perrin. He was 17 or near enough, that awful hinge of an age when a young man has the body of a grown one, and the judgment of a child and the certainty of a king. He came up the mile with 3 others his own age, and they moved the way a pack of young dogs move, shoulder to shoulder, taking up more room than they needed. Their laughter pitched a half note too loud so that strangers would turn and look. Perrin was the loud one. You could tell from 100 feet. There is always a loud one, and the loud one is always the most frightened, though he would sooner die than know it. He wore good clothes gone deliberately careless, an expensive jacket with the collar crushed, boots that cost more than my cart, worn scuffed on purpose. Money then, and the boredom that money breeds in the young when nobody has ever told them no. They stopped in front of Sergeant Thorne the way sightseers stop at first. They pointed, they laughed. One of them stood beside the guard and struck the same pose, chin up, arms stiff, and his friends howled and filmed him, and a few tourists laughed too, and that was fine. That is the ordinary weather of the gate. The guards are used to it. A man who has trained to stand still for 2 hours in the rain has trained also to stand still while a stranger makes rabbit ears behind his bearskin. Sergeant Thorne did not move. His eyes stayed level on the middle distance, on nothing, on the whole world at once. If he was bored or amused or weary of it, no living soul could have told. That is the discipline. That is the thing the crowd comes to see and does not understand it is seeing. But Perrin was not satisfied with the ordinary. I watched it happen and I could not have stopped it. The ordinary pose, the ordinary photograph. His friends had already had those, and the laughter had already crested and started to fall, and a young man like Perrin cannot bear the falling of the laughter. It is the worst thing in his world. So he stepped closer. He stepped inside the invisible line that even fools usually feel, the line of the man's own space, and he leaned his face up toward the shadow under the bearskin, and he said something. I could not hear it from my corner, but I saw the guard's stillness, and I saw the boy's grin, and I saw the grin get thinner and harder when the stillness did not answer it. Because that is the trap the loud boy sets for himself. He mocks a man to get a reaction, and the man gives him nothing, and the nothing is worse than any reaction, and so he must escalate. He must always escalate. The stillness pulls him in like a hole in the road. Say something, Perrin said loud enough now that it carried. Come on, say something. You can't, can you? You just stand there. You're not even a real soldier. You're a doll. You're a wind-up doll they put out for the tourists. A little laughter from his friends, dutiful thinning. Sergeant Thorne did not move. I have thought about that stillness many times since, because at the time I read it as emptiness, the trained blankness of a man switched off at his post, And I was wrong as the boy was, and it took the rest of the morning to teach me how wrong. It was not emptiness. It was the opposite. It was a fullness held under enormous pressure and given no outlet, a thing like a dam, and behind the flat gray face of the dam there was a weight of water you could not guess at. But you cannot see water through stone, neither could Perrin. He saw only the stone, and he mistook the stone for the whole of the man, and that is the mistake around which this entire story turns. He circled the guard. He mimicked the march, stamping his soft boots on the cobbles, swinging his arms like a marionette, letting his tongue loll. His friends laughed again, but it was a laughter with an edge of unease in it now, because a crowd was gathering, the third kind of crowd, the knot, the clot, and a crowd changes a joke. 24 strangers had stopped to watch a boy torment a man who would not answer, and half of them were laughing and half of them were not. And the ones who were not had that particular stiffness of people who want to say something and are ashamed that they will not. I was one of them. I will admit it. I stood by my cart with a hot chestnut going cold in my fingers, and I said nothing, because it was not my place, because the guard was so plainly beyond harm, because surely the boy would run out of nerve and slink away. He did not run out of nerve. He ran out of jokes, which is far more dangerous. When you have mocked a silent man for 5 full minutes and he has not so much as breathed at you, and the crowd's laughter has curdled into that uneasy stiffness, a boy like Perrin has only 2 paths left. He can walk away and feel the whole street watching him walk away with nothing to show for it, the loud one who could not even crack the doll. Or he can do something that cannot be ignored. He can cross a line that forces the world to react, because a reaction, any reaction, even a bad one, is better to him than the unbearable weightlessness of being ignored. I watched him choose. I watched the decision cross his face like a shadow crossing water, and I knew before he moved that he had chosen the second path, and my stomach turned over. What he did, I will set it down plainly because it matters, and because the whole street saw it, was he planted himself square in front of Sergeant Thorne, close enough that the brim of the bearskin threw its shadow over him, and he raised both his hands and he made a gesture. A rude gesture. The rudest he knew, the one boys make to say the ugliest thing without words, aimed straight up into the man's unmoving face, held there, thrust forward twice for emphasis. And to crown it, he leaned in and spat not on the man, he had not quite the courage for that, but at his boots, a contemptuous little splash of it on the polished leather, and he laughed, a short ugly bark of a laugh, and he said, There's your salute, doll. The crowd made a sound, not a gasp exactly, a low, collective, indrawn breath, the sound a crowd makes when a line has been crossed that everyone felt was there and no one drew. Even Perrin's own friends went quiet. Even they knew. There is a difference between mocking the guard and defiling him, and the boy had crossed from the first into the second, and he had done it in front of 40 strangers and a dozen glass phones held up to catch it. And in the silence that followed you could feel the whole street understand, all at once, that something was now going to happen, and that whatever it was, the boy had earned it, and that he did not yet know he had earned it. Sergeant Thorne did not move. That is the part I want you to understand, because it is the part that broke the boy in the end, though he did not break for another hour. The guard did not flinch at the gesture. He did not glance down at his fouled boot. He did not tighten his jaw or narrow his eyes, or give the boy one flicker of the acknowledgement the boy had spent 5 minutes and every scrap of his courage trying to buy. The insult landed on him the way rain lands on a mountain, total and utterly without effect, and running off him into the ground. And I saw, even from my corner, even through the crowd, the exact moment the meaning of that reached Perrin. Because a boy who insults a man wants, above all things, to matter to him, even as an enemy, even as a nuisance, to matter. And Sergeant Thorne had just shown him, without a word, without a glance, in front of the whole street, that he did not matter to him at all, that he was weather, that he was a thing that happened to the boots and would be wiped off later. The gesture had been the biggest thing Perrin could do, and the man had made it into nothing, And there is no humiliation on this earth like doing your very worst and being met with a wall that does not even know you struck it. I saw the boy's face change. The grin was gone. Under it there was something raw and young and frightened, the face of a child who has thrown his hardest punch at a grown man's chest and felt his own small fist bounce off. For one instant, I almost pitied him. Then he did the thing that fools do when they are frightened. He got angry. He reached out to shove the guard. And that is where the morning turned, and where the boy's instant regret began, though the regret would take a shape he could never have imagined, and would not finish teaching him its lesson until long after the crowd had gone home. Let me go back a little, because you cannot understand what the guard did if you do not understand what the guard was, and I did not understand it myself until I heard the rest, later, from a man who knew him. Sergeant Deverell Thorne was 44 years old that morning. He had stood the palace posts for 19 years, and before that he had done 9 years of soldiering that he never spoke of, in places whose names did not appear on the postcards sold 3 stalls down from my cart. He had a wife named Adeline and no children, though they had wanted them, and a small stone house at the edge of the city with a garden his wife tended and he mended, and he was, by every account I ever gathered, the least excitable man in the kingdom. Not cold. The men who served with him were fierce on that point, not cold, only still. He was a man who had learned, in hard places, that the loudest thing in any crisis is usually the least important, and that the discipline to stay silent and unmoving while the world screamed at you was not the absence of feeling but the mastery of it, and that mastery, held long enough, becomes a kind of power that noise can never touch. He had a saying, I was told, that he gave to the young guards who came to him raw and jumpy, twitching at every tourist's shout. The uniform is not yours, he would say. You are borrowing it. The men who wore it before you kept it clean, and the men who wear it after you will judge whether you did the same. When a fool insults you, he is not insulting you. You are nobody. He is insulting the uniform, and the uniform has stood 200 years and will outlast his little rudeness by 200 more. So you do not answer him. You cannot lower the uniform to where he stands. You let him shout up at it, and you let it not hear him, and in an hour he will be gone and it will still be standing. That is not weakness, lad. That is the whole of the strength. Learn it or take it off. That was the man Perrin had chosen to make a fool of. He might as well have shaken his fist at the gatehouse itself, at the 200-year-old stone, and dared it to shake back. Now the shove. Perrin lunged, both hands out, aiming to plant them on the guard's chest and knock him back a step to make him move at last by force, since nothing else had worked. It was the act of a frightened boy, and it was also, though he did not know it, the act that changed everything, because there is a great difference in the law and in the eyes of the world between mocking a guard and laying hands on one. Mockery is rudeness. A shove is an assault. The moment Perrin's hands left his sides, he stopped being a nuisance and became, in the eyes of everyone whose job it was to watch that gate, a threat. And a great many people, it turned out, were watching that gate. Here is what the boy did not know, what none of the laughing pack knew, what I myself did not fully grasp until it was over. The single sentry on the eastern post is never, ever alone. He is the visible tip of a thing that is mostly invisible. Behind the gatehouse windows, in the shadowed arch of the sally port, at the far corners of the forecourt where the tourists never look, there are other men, plainclothes and uniformed, watchers with radios, the response detail whose entire purpose is the 2 seconds between a threat to the post and their hands upon it. The sentry stands still precisely because he does not need to move. His stillness is a promise that others will move for him. And they had been watching Perrin from the moment his loud little pack came up the mile, tracking him the way you track a weather front, and the instant his hands came off his sides they were already moving, and the boy had perhaps half a second of feeling like the bravest young man in the kingdom before the whole shape of his morning changed. He never touched the guard. That is worth saying, because in the telling it is always exaggerated, and I want the truth of it. Perrin's outstretched hands never reached the red wool of the tunic. What happened, and it happened so fast that half the crowd did not see it and had to be told afterward what they had watched, was that two men came out of the crowd itself, men who had been standing among the tourists the whole time, in ordinary coats, indistinguishable from anyone, which was the point of them, and they took the boy. Not brutally. I want that understood too, because it matters to the lesson, and because Sergeant Thorne would have been the first to insist on it. They did not strike him. There was no cruelty in it, and no drama for the phones to feast on. There was only a terrible, practiced, effortless competence. One of them had the boy's outstretched wrist folded down and back before it reached the tunic, turning his own lunge against him so that his forward motion carried him straight down toward the cobbles. The other had his shoulder and his collar. And between the two of them, the boy went from lunging bully to a young man bent double and controlled, and going to his knees on the stone, all in the space of a single breath, with a neatness that told you these were men who had done this 1,000 times and would think no more of it than of tying a shoe. The crowd made its sound again, louder this time, the great collective O of people watching consequence arrive. Perrin's friends scattered backward, of course they did. The loud one's friends always scatter, and stood in a loose, useless ring with their hands half raised, filming even now, filming their own friend on his knees on the cobbles with two calm strangers holding him there, because that is the sickness of the glass phones, that the instinct to record outlives even the instinct to help. And Perrin himself made a sound I will not forget, a high, cracked, undignified sound, half outrage and half pure animal fright, the sound of a boy discovering in one instant that the world has rules after all and that he has just run headlong into one of them. Get off me. Do you know who my father is? He did know, as it turned out. They all did. That was another thing the boy had not counted on, but we will come to the father. Through all of it, Sergeant Thorne had not moved. That was the detail that reached me across the whole width of the forecourt and lodged in my chest and has never quite left it. The response detail had taken the boy. The crowd had cried out. The friends had scattered. The whole small storm had broken and was breaking still, 3 feet from the guard's fouled boot, and Deverell Thorne stood in his box of shadow with his gloved hands folded on his rifle and his eyes level on the middle distance, and he did not look down at the boy, and he did not look at the men holding him, and he did not permit himself so much as the flicker of a satisfied glance. He let it happen around him the way the mountain lets the storm happen around it. He was still the stone in the stream, and I understood, watching him, that this was the deepest cut of all to a boy who had wanted so badly to matter, that even now, even brought to his knees by the very presence he had defiled, he still could not make the man acknowledge him. The guard would not even give him the dignity of a look of triumph. He was that far beneath the uniform's notice. And I saw Perrin see it on his knees, his face turned up and sideways, searching the guard's face for something, anger, satisfaction, hatred, anything, and finding nothing at all, the same level unbothered distance the man had shown a strolling tourist, and I watched something go out of the boy in that instant that was more than his bravado. Something in him understood, for the first time in his short, loud life, that he had made himself small, and that no one had made him small but himself. A senior man came out from the gatehouse then, an officer, you could tell by the way the others straightened when he came, a lean gray man named, I later learned, Warden Captain Aldous Rook, who had charge of the forecourt guard and who moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once in his life had to raise his voice to be obeyed. He looked at the boy on the cobbles. He looked at the fouled boot, at the spittle drying on the polished leather, and I saw his jaw tighten a fraction, which on a face like that was the equivalent of another man roaring. He looked at the ring of phones, and then he did something that told me more than anything what kind of place I was standing outside of. He did not have the boy dragged off. He crouched, the warden captain of the forecourt guard crouched down on his heels on the cobbles to bring his gray eyes level with the boy's frightened ones. And he spoke to him, quietly, so quietly that I could not hear a word of it from my corner, for perhaps 30 seconds, while the whole street held its breath. And whatever he said, I watched the last of the fight go out of Perrin as he said it, watched the boy's face crumble from outrage into something younger and worse, and when the warden captain stood up again, the boy did not struggle anymore. He came to his feet when the two men lifted him, and he went with them through the sally port out of the sun, and the gate closed behind them, and the eastern post stood empty for perhaps 90 seconds until a second guard stepped smartly out to take it. And Sergeant Thorne, the man himself, the fouled and unbothered Stone, turned on his heel with parade precision and marched back through the gate to be relieved, and did not once look back at the place where the boy had been. The crowd broke up slowly, the way crowds do after a thing they will tell wrong for years. The tourists compared their films. Perrin's friends had already fled. I turned my chestnuts, which had all gone cold and hard as pebbles, and I threw the whole tray of them out because I had no more stomach for selling that morning. And I stood at my cold cart and thought about the man who had not moved, and I believed, as you probably believe, reading this, that the story was over. The boy had done his worst and been humbled and been taken away, and the guard had won without lifting a gloved finger, and that was the lesson, neat and complete. Mock the uniform, and the uniform's quiet strength will make a small ruin of you in front of the whole street. I was wrong. That was not the story. That was only the first act of it, the loud and public part, the part the phones caught. The real story, the part that made a man of the boy instead of only a fool, the part no glass phone was there to see, happened over the weeks that followed, behind the gate in the quiet, and I would not have known any of it if the boy himself had not come back, months later, to find me at my corner and told me. But I am getting ahead. Let me tell it as it came. What the warden captain had said to Perrin, crouched on the cobbles, was this. I have it from the boy, word for word, because he never forgot it, because it was the first time in his life a grown man had spoken to him as though what he did mattered rather than as though he himself did. Rook had said, "You are not in trouble because you offended a man. He is not offended. You cannot offend that man. He is too well made for it, and you are too small to reach him, and you have spent 5 minutes proving it to a whole street. You are in trouble because you laid hands on the king's post, and that is a thing the law does not permit and I do not permit. Now, you can go one of two ways from here, and which one is entirely yours. You can go the way your friends are already running and be a boy who did an ugly thing and was punished for it and learned nothing. Or you can come inside this gate with me, and I can show you the man you spat at and let you learn who he is, and what the uniform is that you fouled, and you can walk out a different creature than you walked in. I have no interest in ruining you, boy. I have children of my own. But I will not let you leave here the same as you came. Choose." And Perrin, 17 and terrified and for once in his life listening, had chosen to go inside. Now I must tell you about the father, because the father is why the boy was the way he was, and why the mourning at the gate went the way it did, and because the father's part in it is a warning of its own. Perrin's father was a man named Corwin Vale, and Corwin Vale was rich, properly rich, the kind of rich that buys a name and then buys the forgetting of how the name was bought. He had made his fortune in shipping and building and the moving of money from one place to another, and he had made it hard, and he was, by every account, a man who had never in his adult life heard the word no from anyone he could not fire or ruin. He had married late and buried his wife early. Perrin's mother had died when the boy was 9, and he had raised the boy the way such men often raise a motherless son, with everything and nothing, everything of money, nothing of himself. Perrin had grown up in a great cold house full of servants who could not correct him, tutors who could not fail him, and a father who appeared at long intervals like weather, gave orders, gave money, and vanished again into the machinery of his own importance. The boy had never wanted for a single thing a coin could buy, and had never once, not once, been told that he could not have a thing he wanted, or made to feel the weight of another human being's dignity as equal to his own. And a boy raised so does not grow up gentle. He grows up starved in a way that looks, from the outside, like being spoiled. The loudness, the rudeness, the desperate need to matter to a silent stranger at a gate, all of it was the hunger of a boy who had never mattered to the one man whose attention he actually wanted, and had gone out into the world trying to force from strangers the thing his own father had never given him. I did not know any of this that morning, of course. I knew only a rude boy on his knees crying out his father's importance, as though a father's importance were a spell that could unlock any door. Do you know who my father is? As it happened, the men of the forecourt guard did know who his father was, and it did not help him at all, and it very nearly made everything a great deal worse, because Corwin Vale, when the palace's discreet message reached his tower of offices 2 hours later, did exactly what a man like Corwin Vale does. He came down in a fury, not at his son, but at the palace to make the whole thing disappear. He arrived at the forecourt in the middle of the afternoon in a long dark car, and he came through the visitor's gate with a lawyer at each shoulder, and the particular walk of a man who is used to buildings emptying of resistance as he approaches, and he demanded, of the warden captain of the king's own forecourt guard, that his son be released at once, that the regrettable little incident be forgotten, that no record be made. And I am told, he took out his checkbook there in the guardroom and asked, in the flat-bored voice of a man settling a bill, how much it would take to make the whole thing go away. He believed, you see, the thing his son believed, that the uniform could be bought or shouted down or made to bend. The son had learned it from the father. The son had gone to the gate that morning and made a rude gesture at a man he thought could be treated as a thing, and now the father had come to the same gate and made, in effect, exactly the same gesture. A checkbook thrust up into the face of an institution he thought too small to matter, and he was about to learn, as his son had learned, that he had misread the stone for the whole of the mountain. Warden Captain Rook looked at the checkbook. He looked at the two lawyers. He looked, I am told, for rather a long time in the level, unhurried, unbothered way that seemed to be the house style of every man behind that gate, and then he said something that Corwin Vale did not expect and had no answer for. He said, "Put that away, sir, before one of my men has to note that you offered it. Your son is not for sale, and neither am I, and neither is the thing you seem to think you can buy. I have not asked you for money. I have not, in fact, asked you for anything. I sent for you because your son is a minor in the custody of the Crown's Guard, and the law requires that his father be informed, and because, though I begin to see why the boy is as he is, I had hoped his father might wish to be part of setting him right. I see that hope was misplaced. Sit down, sir. Sit down and be quiet, and let me tell you what your son did, and then let me tell you what he is going to do about it. And if at the end of it you still want your lawyers and your checkbook, you may have them, and you may explain to a magistrate why you tried to buy your son out of the single most useful lesson of his life." I would have given a great deal to see Corwin Vale's face. By all accounts no one had spoken to him so in 20 years, and by all accounts he sat down. Not because he was persuaded, a man like that is never persuaded in a day, but because he was, for the first time in a very long time, in a room he could not buy, in front of men he could not fire, and the sheer novelty of it silenced him. And in that silence, the warden captain told him about the man his son had spat at. Because here is the thing about Sergeant Deverell Thorne that made the boy's gesture so much smaller than the boy had known, and that made the whole crowd's laughter, when they finally understood, curdle into shame. The man Perrin had called a doll, a wind-up toy, not even a real soldier. The man he had spat at and lunged at to force some flicker of feeling from, was not merely a decorated soldier of 19 years palace service, and 9 years before that in places without postcards. He was a man who, 4 years earlier, had carried 2 wounded comrades out of a collapsed building through a fire that had taken the skin off his own back and shoulders, and had gone back in for a third, and had brought that one out too, and had done it so quietly, and told so few people that he had refused the ceremony they wanted to give him, and had asked only to be allowed to return to his post at the gate. Under the red wool tunic, across the whole width of his back, Deverell Thorne carried the scars of that fire, scars he never showed and never spoke of, and he stood 2 hours at a time in the sun, and the rain with that ruined skin under the wool and did not so much as shift his weight, because the discipline that a rude boy had mistaken for the emptiness of a doll was in fact the hardest one thing that man owned, forged in a place that would have unmade the boy in an afternoon. That was the toy soldier. That was the man too small to matter. Perrin had made his rude gesture up into the face of a man who had walked into fire for strangers 3 times in one night, and the man had not even looked down. And now, the boy was going to find out exactly who he had spat at, and the finding out was going to be the making of him. The warden captain did not tell Perrin any of this to shame him, or not only to shame him. He told him because he had watched from the gatehouse window that morning a starved boy make himself small in front of a whole street, and he had recognized the starvation, having seen it in other boys, and he had decided in the crouched 30 seconds on the cobbles that this one was worth the trouble of saving. It is a thing I have come to believe about the men behind that gate, that the discipline they keep is not for its own sake, not merely a show for the tourists, but a thing they keep in trust, a standard held high enough that a lost boy might see it and reach for it. Sergeant Thorne had not answered the boy's mockery because you cannot lower the uniform to where a fool stands. But the uniform, held high and clean and unbending, is also a hand held down for anyone with the humility to take it. The boy had spent his whole morning trying to drag the man down to his own small level. Now he was going to be given the far harder, far better thing, the chance to be lifted. What happened behind the gate over the following weeks came to me in pieces, some from the boy himself, months later at my corner, some from a guardsman named Halloran who bought chestnuts from me twice a week and had a loose and generous tongue. Some I have had to weave together from what I know of the men and the place. But the shape of it is true, and the heart of it is exactly true, and I will tell it as though I had stood in the room, because in a way I have stood in that room 100 times since, in my mind, turning it over. The magistrate, when the matter finally reached one, did a thing that surprised everyone, and that I have since learned is not so rare as I thought. Rather than fine the boy, or shame him with a record that his father's money could have buried anyway, the magistrate, a dry, kind, unhurried woman who had clearly taken the measure of both father and son in about 4 minutes, ordered that Perrin should make his amends in service. He was to report to the forecourt guard, to the warden captain's charge, for a period of some weeks, and do whatever work was found for him and reflect, and be seen to have set right what he could of the thing he had done. It was not a punishment, exactly. It was the opposite of the thing his father would have bought him. His father had spent 17 years teaching him that consequences were for other people and could always be made to vanish. The magistrate, in one afternoon, taught him that some things cannot be paid off and must instead be worked off, and that the working is the point. And so the rich boy who had never in his life carried anything heavier than his own contempt was set to carrying things. He swept the sally port. He polished the great brass on the visitor's gate until his soft hands blistered and then hardened. He carried and stacked and cleaned and stood where he was told to stand, under the eye of the guardsman Halloran, who was young enough not to be gentle with him, and had a low opinion of spoiled boys that Perrin spent the first week thoroughly earning. The boy was sullen at first, of course. He was furious. He had been humiliated in front of the whole city. His father had come and failed to save him. The boy did not yet know how nearly his father had made everything worse, and would not know for some time, and now he was blistering his hands sweeping a gate for men he still, in his sullen heart, thought of as dolls in costumes. He did the work badly and resentfully and looked for every chance to shirk it, and Halloran let him, up to a point, because Halloran had been told to let the boy fail on his own until failing stopped being satisfying. The turn came, as these turns so often do, not from a lecture but from a small thing the boy was not meant to see. It was near the end of Perrin's first week, and it was raining, one of those gray slantwise rains that come off the river and soak a man to the skin in 10 minutes. and Perrin had been set to cleaning the guardroom windows on the inside, which meant he had a clear view out across the wet forecourt to the eastern post. And there, in the rain, stood Sergeant Deverell Thorne. 2 hours on the post, and it was the coldest, wettest part of them, and the tourists had all fled the weather, and there was no one at all to see him. Not a single glass phone, not a single face, no audience, no reason on earth to keep the discipline except the discipline itself. And the man stood in the driving rain exactly as he had stood in the morning sun, gloved hands folded on the rifle, bearskin darkening with wet, water running off the brim and down the red wool. Boots in the same worn place on the stone, and he did not move, not to shift his weight, not to ease the cold, not to wipe the rain from his eyes, for no one, for nothing. And Perrin stood at the window with a rag in his blistered hand and watched him, and could not stop watching him, because it did something to the boy that all the lectures had not. You see, Perrin had built himself a comfortable little theory in his first sullen week. The guards kept still, he had decided, because people were watching. It was a performance. It was for the tourists and the phones and the pay. Take away the audience and they would slouch and yawn and scratch like anyone. That was the theory that let him keep his contempt. And now, through a rain-streaked window, with no audience anywhere in the world, he watched Sergeant Thorne keep the discipline for its own sake. For no one, because it was who he was and not merely what he did, and the theory died. The boy stood there a long time. Halloran, coming in later, found him still at the window, the rag dry in his hand, watching the man in the rain, and had the wit to say nothing at all, and to leave him to it. That was the crack in the boy through which everything else got in. The next thing that reached him, and this is the part that I think finished the turning of him, he learned by accident and about the fire. He was cleaning in a corridor off the guardroom, and he heard 2 of the older men talking, not about him, not for his benefit, only 2 old comrades talking the way old comrades do, and one of them said something about Deverell and the burned building and the third man he had gone back for, and Perrin, who had been about to walk on, stopped and listened, and heard the whole of it. He heard that the doll, the wind-up toy, the man who was not even a real soldier, had walked into a burning building 3 times and carried 3 men out, and let the skin burn off his own back doing it, and then refused the medal and asked only to go back to his gate. He heard that the still, unbothered, unbreakable stillness he had spat at was the stillness of a man who had already faced the worst thing that could happen to a body and had made his peace with pain in a furnace, and that a rude boy's gesture was, to such a man, so far beneath notice that not noticing it required no effort at all. And Perrin, I have this from the boy himself, and his voice shook telling it to me. Months later, Perrin went out to the empty Sally Port and was quietly, thoroughly sick, not from disgust but from shame, the first true shame of his young life. And then he sat on the cold stone for a long time and understood, finally and completely, exactly what he had done, and exactly how small it had made him, and exactly how far he had to climb to become the sort of man who would have the right to even sweep that gate, let alone stand at it. That is regret, not the flinch on the cobbles when the guards took his wrist. That was only fright. This was the real thing, the slow arriving thing, the regret that reorganizes a life. And it had come to him not because anyone had crushed him, but because he had at last been shown, clearly and without cruelty, the true size of the man he had mocked and the true smallness of the mockery, and there is no punishment on earth so complete as being made to see yourself truly. The guards had not broken the boy. They had done the far harder thing. They had let him break himself against the truth, and then they had been standing there, when he was ready, with a broom and a rag and a low, steady voice, to show him how a man rebuilds. There is a thing I must tell about the wider world, too, because it was part of the boy's ordeal, and part of what nearly ruined him before the rain-streaked window could save him, and it is a thing peculiar to our own noisy age. The glass phones had caught it all. Of course they had. 40 phones held up at the eastern post that morning, and by the afternoon the boy's rude gesture and his fouled spittle and his instant humbling on the cobbles were racing across the whole kingdom, passed hand to hand down the endless bright rivers of the little screens, and the whole city, and then the whole realm, was watching a 17-year-old boy do the worst and stupidest thing of his life, over and over, 100,000 times, a million. And the realm was not kind. Why would it be? A rude rich boy spitting at the boots of the king's own guard is exactly the sort of thing that a great many tired and angry people are only too glad to have a chance to despise, safely, from a distance, at no cost to themselves. The comments beneath the videos, Halloran showed me some of them, on his own little screen, shaking his head, were a torrent of contempt, and much of it was uglier by far than anything the boy had done. Strangers who had never met Perrin wished terrible things upon him. Strangers named his father and his school and his street. Strangers who prided themselves on their decency behaved, in the safety of the little screens, exactly as badly as the boy had behaved at the gate, and never once saw the mirror of it. A boy who had spent his whole life desperate to matter to strangers had, in a single morning, come to matter to millions of them, in the worst possible way, as a thing to be hated. And it was, I think, very nearly the end of him, because it confirmed the darkest thing he already believed about himself, which was that he was worthless, and now the whole world agreed. That was the cruelest tier of the boy's ordeal, and it is worth pausing on, because it is where the guard's way and the world's way part company most sharply. The world wanted the boy destroyed. The world had its video and its verdict and its appetite, and it wanted the satisfying end. The rich boy ruined, made an example of, ground to nothing, so that everyone watching could feel, for an afternoon, like a good person by comparison. And if the boy had been left to the world would have had its way, and a starved 17-year-old would have been crushed under a million strangers' contempt into something that would never have grown into a man at all. But the boy had not been left to the world. He had been taken behind the gate, into the quiet, into the charge of men who did not care in the slightest what the little screen said, who had a wholly different measure of a person than the number of strangers cheering his downfall, and who set him not to being destroyed but to sweeping a sally port. That is the difference. The world humbles a fool to be rid of him. The guards humbled the boy to make something of him. The gesture looks the same from outside, a proud boy brought low, but the aim could not be more opposite, and the aim is everything. Warden Captain Rook, I am told, would not let a single one of his men so much as glance at the videos in the boy's presence, nor speak of them, nor let the boy imagine for one moment that the roar of the little screens had any weight at all behind that gate. "You are not what 100,000 strangers say you are," he told the boy once plainly, when Perrin came in one morning gray-faced and hollow-eyed from a night spent reading the ugliest things ever written about him. "You are what you do with your 2 hands in front of me today. That is the only ledger I keep, and it is the only one that has ever mattered, and the screen you were reading last night keeps no ledger at all, it only feeds. Put it away and pick up the broom." And that, too, was a kind of saving. The boy had thought the whole world was his judge. He learned behind the gate that the whole world's judgment was worth precisely nothing, and that the only judgment that had ever mattered was the quiet, steady judgment of a few good men who could see him clearly, and who, seeing him clearly, had decided he was worth the trouble. It is a lesson the whole of our screen-lit age might stand to learn, and I have never seen it taught better than it was taught to that one lost boy behind that one old gate. Corwin Vale, meanwhile, was undergoing an education of his own, and it did not go nearly so gently, because a boy of 17 can be remade, and a man of 60 usually cannot, and it took a shock rather larger than a rainy window to reach him. His shock, when it came, wore the shape of a princess. Princess Adela was the king's sister, and she was, in the ordinary run of things, the last member of the royal house you would expect to trouble herself with a rude boy at a gate. She was a woman of perhaps 60, plain-spoken to the point of severity, with no patience at all for ceremony that had gone hollow, and a great deal of patience for the small, unglamorous work of the house. The pensions of old servants, the schooling of orphaned children of the guard, the quiet ledgers of honor that no one photographs. She had, it turned out, a particular and personal reason to care about Sergeant Deverell Thorne, though I did not learn it until the very end, and it is the hinge of the whole latter half of this story, so I will hold it a little longer, as it was held from me. What is certain is that word of the incident at the Eastern Post reached her, as much of what happens behind that gate eventually does, and that she took an interest in it that surprised even the warden captain. And when Corwin Vale, some days later, still smarting from his failure to buy the matter away and unable to leave any wound unpoked, made a second attempt, this time not with a checkbook but with influence, calling in a favor from a man he knew who knew a man at court, trying to have the whole affair quietly reclassified as an unfortunate misunderstanding, and his son's service quietly ended early. It was Princess Adela who heard of the attempt, and Princess Adela who put a stop to it. And Princess Adela who sent for Corwin Vale to come and explain himself to her directly. I would give the rest of my chestnut days to have been a fly on the wall of that room. What I have of it is second-hand, from Halloran, who had it from the man who stood the door, and it is enough. Corwin Vale came in expecting to manage a difficult old woman the way he had managed 1,000 difficult people, with charm and pressure and the unspoken weight of his money. He found instead a woman entirely immune to all three, who had read the whole file, who knew precisely what he had tried to buy and precisely why, and who did not raise her voice once. She let him make his case. She let him explain that his son was young, that it had been a foolish prank, that no real harm had been done, that surely a family of their standing need not be dragged through weeks of menial service over a moment's boyish rudeness, that he would of course make a most generous contribution to any fund the house cared to name. And when he had finished, she looked at him for a while, the level, unhurried look that seemed to be a birthright behind that gate, and then she said, "So I am told, something very close to this. Mr. Vale, I have read what your son did, and I have read what you did afterward, and I will tell you which of the two troubles me more. It is not the boy. Boys are foolish. That is nearly the definition of a boy. A foolish boy is a field that has not yet been planted, and I have some hope for yours. It is you who trouble me. Your son stood before my brother's gate and made an ugly gesture at a man he thought too low to matter, and that was ignorance, and ignorance can be taught. But you, sir, a grown man, a man of the world, a man who has surely been told no at least once in his life, even if you have forgotten it, you came to that same gate, and you did in effect the very same thing your son had done. You made a rude gesture at something you thought too small to matter. You waved your money in the face of an honor you cannot buy, and when that failed you tried to wave your friends, and it did not once occur to you that the thing you were waving at might be larger than you. Your son learned his contempt somewhere, Mr. Vale. He did not invent it. He learned it at your knee, in your cold great house, from a father who taught him by every action of his life that other people are things and consequences are for the poor. And now you have come to me to buy him out of the one lesson that might undo the harm you have done him, and I find that I will not permit it. Your son will finish his service, and I would suggest, sir, most seriously, that you come and stand beside him while he does it, not to supervise, to sweep, because I think it might be the first honest work of your life, and I think, if you had the courage for it, it might save more than the boy." There was, I am told, a very long silence, and then Corwin Vale, who had come in to manage an old woman and had instead been quietly, comprehensively, and mercifully taken apart, said nothing at all and rose and left, and no one expected to see him again. That was the false dawn of this story, the moment when it looked as though the father, at least, was beyond saving, and the boy would finish his weeks of service and go home to the same cold house and the same cold man and lose in a season whatever the rain-streaked window had begun to teach him. Because a boy cannot be remade and then sent back into the very furnace of neglect that unmade him in the first place and be expected to hold. The guards knew it. The warden captain knew it. Even the boy, in some dim way, knew it. I think that is why, in his last week of service, the sullenness came back on him. A harder and sadder sullenness than before. The sullenness of a boy who has glimpsed a better self and does not believe he will be allowed to keep it. He swept the gate and polished the brass and did the work well now, honestly and well. And he watched Sergeant Thorne stand his post in all weathers and had come, in his quiet way, to half-worship the man. But he had never once spoken to him, because he could not imagine what he could possibly say, and because he was ashamed, and because Thorne, for his own reasons, had let the boy alone, watching him from a distance with a patience the boy did not know was there. And the days ran down toward the end of the boy's service, and it seemed the story would close on a small, sad note. A lesson half learned, a father unreachable, a boy sent back to the cold. And then, on the last morning of Perrin's service, with the whole thing all but over, two things happened that turned it one final time, and turned it for good, and I will tell them in their order. The first was this. Perrin came to the gate that last morning as he had come every morning before the crowds in the thin early light, and he found Sergeant Deverell Thorne already there, not at his post, not yet, but standing by the sally port out of uniform, in a plain gray coat, an ordinary man you would pass in the street without a glance, waiting. Waiting, it was plain, for the boy. And Perrin, who had rehearsed 1,000 apologies over the weeks and had never once found the courage to deliver a single one, stopped where he stood, and felt his whole prepared speech go to ash in his mouth, and could say nothing at all. Thorne spoke first. That was a gift, and the boy knew it. The man could have made him grope for it, could have stood in his awful patient stillness and let the boy flounder, and it would have been no more than the boy deserved. Instead he spoke first, and he spoke plainly, and he made it easy, which was the last thing the boy expected and the thing that undid him completely. "They tell me you've worked well these last weeks," Thorne said. "Halloran doesn't praise easily. He praised you." He let that sit a moment. "Then I want to say a thing to you, and then I'll let you finish your morning, and we'll neither of us make more of it than it needs. Are you listening?" The boy nodded. He did not trust his voice. "When you stood at my post and did what you did," Thorne said, "I felt nothing. I want you to know that because I think it has been eating at you, and I'd rather you had the truth of it than whatever you've been telling yourself. I did not feel insulted. I did not feel angry. I felt nothing, because the uniform I wear was standing at that gate 200 years before you were born, and will stand there 200 years after we're both dust. And a boy's rudeness cannot touch a thing that large, any more than you could insult the sea by throwing a stone at it. I did not stay still because I was strong, lad. I stayed still because you were small and there was nothing there to answer. Do you understand me? The stillness was not for you. Almost nothing that morning was about you at all. Perrin, I am told, could barely stand under it, because it was the kindest cruel thing anyone had ever said to him, or the cruelest kind thing, and both at once, that his worst, his loudest, his most desperate act, the thing he had done to force some flicker of feeling from a stranger, had landed on a man so far above his reach that it made not the slightest ripple. It was the total demolition of the boy's whole idea of himself as a person who could make a mark on the world by force. And it should have crushed him. But Thorne was not finished, and the next thing he said was the thing that saved him. "But you're not small anymore," Thorne said, "and that's why I waited for you this morning. The boy who spat at my boots was small. He was a starved little thing making noise because no one had ever fed him. I've seen 100 of him. But the young man who has swept this gate for 3 weeks with blistered hands and never once complained where I could hear it, who stood at that window in the rain and could not stop watching, who was sick in my sally port when he learned a thing he was never meant to learn, and then came back the next morning and swept it anyway, that young man is not small. That young man I would let stand a watch beside me, if the world were arranged differently. So I'll not accept your apology because the boy who owed it to me no longer exists, and I've no quarrel with the man who's replaced him. Go and finish your morning. And Perrin, and here the boy said the man looked at him fully for the first and only time, level and gray, and without the slightest distance in it now, all the way in. Carry it well. Whatever it is you go on to carry. The uniform is not the only thing a man can keep clean. And that was all. Thorn turned and went to change into his tunic and stand his post, and Perrin went and finished his morning's work with tears on his face that he did not bother to hide. And the great transformation of the boy was, in that moment, complete, not because he had been punished, but because he had been seen, truly and generously and all the way through, by the one man in the world whose seeing he had craved and could not name. But I said 2 things happened that morning, and the second was the one that undid the false dawn and saved not only the boy but, against all expectation, the father too. The second thing was that Corwin Vale came to the gate. He came at the gray hour before the crowds as his son had come, and he came alone, no car, no lawyers, no checkbook, no long dark coat of importance. He came in a plain coat, on foot like an ordinary man, and he stood outside the sally port for a long time before he could make himself go in, the way his son had stood before Thorn unable to speak, so that anyone watching would have seen the resemblance between them plain as a stamp. 2 proud starved creatures at the same gate, learning the same lesson a generation apart. And when he finally went in, he did not ask for the warden captain, and he did not ask for his son. He asked Halloran quietly where the brooms were kept. I did not believe it when Halloran first told me. I said, surely not, surely a man like that. And Halloran said he had not believed it either, had stood there gaping, and had had to be asked twice. But it was true. Corwin Vale, the shipping magnate, the man who had never heard no, the man who had tried to buy the king's own honor and been quietly taken apart by a princess for the attempt, Corwin Vale took a broom in his soft ringed hands on the last morning of his son's service, and went out into the sally port and began to sweep. Badly. Resentfully at first, exactly as his son had begun, but he swept. And when Perrin came around the corner of the gatehouse with his own broom and saw his father there, his cold, distant, unreachable father, on his knees to no man, but stooped over a broom in a servant's work in the gray dawn, the boy stopped as if he had been struck, and the 2 of them looked at each other across the wet stones, and neither of them said a single word. And Halloran had the great good sense to walk away and leave them to it. I do not know what passed between them because no one saw it and neither ever told. But I know that they swept the sally port together, the father and the son, in silence in the gray light, until the work was done. And I know what Princess Adela had said to the father in that room, come and sweep beside him. It might save more than the boy, and I know the father heard it and turned it away, and left, and everyone thought that was the end of him. And I know that somewhere in the days between, alone in his cold great house, that hard old man had done the hardest thing a hard old man can do, which is to look honestly at his own life, and see the ruin he had made of his only son by the slow neglect of years, and to understand that the princess had been right, and that the only road back ran through a broom and a gate, and a humility he had spent 60 years despising. That he came at all, that he found the courage to be seen, badly, sweeping, by the son he had failed, was the largest thing that small proud man had ever done. And it was the guard's stillness that had begun it. Every bit of it, the whole long chain, ran back to a man in a red tunic who had felt nothing when he was spat at, and had let a boy break himself against the truth, and had waited, patient as stone, to help him build again. Now I promised you the hinge, Princess Adela's own reason, the thing held back from me as it was held back from everyone until the very end, and it is this, and it explains why a king's sister troubled herself over a rude boy at a gate, and it is, to my mind, the most quietly moving part of the whole affair. 30-odd years before, when Princess Adela had been a young woman and the world a more dangerous place than the tourists on the King's Mile could imagine, there had been a night. She has never told the whole of it publicly, and I will not pretend to, when a threat came very close to the royal family, closer than the histories admit, and a young soldier, barely more than a boy himself, had stood between that threat and the king's line and had not moved, though moving would have saved his own skin, and had held his ground until help came and had been badly hurt for it, and had never once spoken of it or asked a thing in return. That young soldier had grown into an old habit of stillness, and a scarred back, and a plain gray coat over a red tunic, and a post at the eastern gate. Defiled Thorn had been that young man. Princess Adela had never forgotten it, and never would, and when word reached her that some rich man's foolish son had spat at the boots of the man who had once stood between her whole family and the dark, and that the rich man was now trying to buy the matter into silence, she had felt something rise in her that 30 years had not cooled, and she had reached out her hand, not to crush the boy, for Thorn himself would never have wanted that, but to make certain the lesson was allowed to land, and that the man who had given so much and asked for nothing was honored, at least this once, by having his patience with a lost boy protected from a father's money. It was, in its way, the truest form of what the whole niche is about. The debts of honor that no one photographs, paid quietly, years late, by those who remember. So the boy never knew, standing sullen at his broom, that the man he had mocked had once saved the very princess whose hand was, invisibly, shaping his own redemption. And the man never knew, standing his post in the rain, that the boy he had spoken kindly to on that last morning would carry those words the rest of his life. And that is how honor moves through a place like that, sideways, unseen, generation to generation. A chain of quiet debts, none of them ever quite spoken aloud. The rest I can tell quickly, because the rest is only the fruit of it. Perrin finished his service that last morning and went home with his father, and they were, by every account I ever gathered, different men in the same cold house from that day, not perfect, for men are not remade perfect, but different, honest with one another for the first time in the boy's memory, a father learning too late but not too late to be a father, a son learning that he had mattered all along to the one man he thought he never had. Corwin Vale gave up trying to buy the world into silence. He never became a warm man, I am told, but he became a present one, and for a boy who had spent 17 years starved of a father's presence, present was enough, present was everything. And Perrin himself, well, I know what became of Perrin because Perrin told me. He came back, you see. That is how I have the whole of this story, the parts no phone caught, the parts behind the gate. He came back to my corner of the King's Mile some months after his service ended, a young man now instead of a boy, taller and quieter and easier in his own skin, and he bought a bag of my chestnuts, and he stood a while and watched the eastern post, where another guard stood his silent watch in the afternoon sun. And then he told me who he was, and I nearly dropped my tray, because I had thought of that morning 100 times and never once thought I would see the boy again, let alone see him grown so. He told me he was going to soldier. Not the palace guard. He was honest enough to know he had not yet earned the right to even hope for that, and might never, but soldiering, real soldiering, the kind that goes to hard places without postcards, because he wanted, he said, to become the sort of man who could keep a thing clean. He used those exact words, and I knew at once where he had got them. He said Sergeant Thorn had never spoken to him again after that last morning, and that he had never tried to speak to him, because he understood now that some debts are not paid with words but with a life, and that the only apology worth making to a man like that was to become a man like that, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making it. He said he thought about the rain-streaked window every single day. He said the worst morning of his life had been the best thing that ever happened to him, and that he had spent a long time being angry about that before he learned to be grateful for it, and that gratitude was the harder and the better thing, as most of the true things are. And then he did something I did not expect. He turned to the eastern post, to the stranger standing his watch there in Thorn's place, a man he had never met and who had no idea who he was, and he stood up straight and he saluted him. Not a mocking salute, not the ugly gesture of a boy who wanted to matter. A real one, stiff and clumsy and utterly sincere, held a long moment, given to the uniform and the 200 years behind it, and to the scarred still man who had shown him what it meant to keep a thing clean. The guard, of course, did not react, could not, would not, being on his post, and Perrin did not need him to. He had spent one whole loud morning once trying to force a stranger to acknowledge him, and it had made a ruin of him. And now he stood at the same gate and gave without needing anything back at all. And that, I think, is the whole distance a man travels between a boy and a man, laid out on 20 feet of cobblestone. He shook my hand and thanked me for the chestnuts and walked off up the King's Mile, and I never saw him again. But I have thought of him often, and I think of him now, telling you this, an old man at a cold cart who has watched the great river of that street break around that one still man for 31 winters. People come to the gate to see the guard who does not move. They hold up their little glass phones and they wait for him to flinch, and they call it discipline, the not flinching, and they are not wrong, but they have the small end of it, because the discipline is not the point. The stillness is not the point. They are only the surface of the thing, the stone face of the dam. What is behind it? The weight of water, the man who walked into fire and asked for nothing, the princess who never forgot, the low kind voice on a gray last morning, the hand held down to a starved and foolish boy. That is the point, and no phone has ever caught it, and no rude gesture has ever reached it, and it does not need catching or reaching, because it will still be standing at that gate, clean and unbroken and quietly saving the occasional lost boy. 200 years after the last of us who watched that morning is gone. The insolent boy learned that in the space of an hour, and it took him the space of a life to understand what he had learned. I am still learning it myself, at my cold cart, one winter at a time. That is the whole of it. He mocked the man who does not move, and made a rude gesture up into a face that would not answer, and he regretted it in an instant, but the instant was only the beginning. The regret grew into shame, and the shame into understanding, and the understanding into a better man, which is the only kind of regret worth having. And the guard, who felt nothing that morning and stood like a stone in a stream, never knew he had done any of it. He only stood his watch and kept the thing clean and let the truth do the rest. That is the strength the tourists come to see and do not see. That is the King's Guard. I have sold chestnuts in its shadow for 31 winters, and I would not trade the sight of it for any warmer trade in the world.